We're in our second week of talking about how do we help the next generation win in faith and life. It's a series that I try to do every year, and I update it each year to sort of reflect what's going on in culture around us. And I had a great firsthand view of it this week. So I was the camp pastor at our kids' summer camp in the Poconos, and I got to talk with 10, 11, 12-year-olds, and some of whom gave their life to Jesus Christ. I had kid come up to me and be like, okay, how do I receive Jesus? Tell me. It's like, that's every pastor's dream, is to hear those words. And doing that for kids never gets old. Never gets old. So I also had a chance to have some great conversations with their counselors who are about 18, 19, 20, talking about what do they think about what's going on in the life of the church, what are things that they're looking for in church. It was really, really fascinating. And I think if we really love the next generation and want them to win, we got to take the time to get to know them. And that's what this second part of the sermon series is about. Last week, we kind of set it up. We talked about culture. We talked about Nehemiah and what's the right posture to have. And today, we're getting more into who is the next generation? What are their hopes and wants and hurts and dreams? And how do we reach them with the gospel? So, just a quick review. Last week we talked about Alan Roxburgh's book, Missional, and how there was this metaphor about the church in America is like reefs around the world that have been dying because the sea has changed. And much like the sea change that has caused them to die, we've had a sea change of American culture, actually global culture, that has changed the way that people experience God and changed how people feel about the church. It used to be that the gravitational pull of society was towards church, and now it's clearly away from church. And even worse than that, what Roxburgh says in his book, I happen to agree with, is that I think the church, the reason why they're dying is because we've forgotten our mission. 67% of churches in America are under 100 members and worship less than 50. 67% of churches. Because we've forgotten our mission. Somehow along the way, it's become more about our own personal preferences than trying to reach the next generation. And churches today are paying for it. This is what happens when you don't take seriously what the next generation needs. It reminds me of Judges 2:10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. A few years ago, we were at some family function, and when I became a pastor, I think my family didn't know what to do with me, so they asked me to pray for stuff. Like at holiday, like we never really prayed before, and then they just asked me to pray because I think that's what they were supposed to do. But anyway, we're getting ready to have some holiday meal, and they're just like, okay, Jason, do you want to pray? And my little cousin, who's probably like 7 years old, said, what is pray? Never heard of it. Had no idea what we were talking about. I think what we'll find is that this next generation, like I know there's all these stats that we've looked at the last couple of years that seem really negative about how they don't declare themselves Christian and maybe they're more inclined to say that they're atheists. But I think it's not because they're against Jesus. I think they just don't know who Jesus is. I think it's more out of ignorance of Jesus than anything else, because the research also shows, and we'll talk about this in a minute, that this generation, this youngest generation, is the most open of all generations to Jesus, which is, I think, where a lot of great hope is. So what we learned, this is just review last week for those who weren't here, our approach should be like Nehemiah's. The first thing is, it's okay to grieve what's been lost. It's okay to grieve the state of things. But then it's time to pray up. All right, God, what do you want me to do? How do we change this thing? And then we need to use everything at our disposal to do something about it. That's what Nehemiah teaches us when the walls of Jerusalem were in shambles and the faithful remnant was struggling. He grieved, he prayed, and then he used every lever he can pull, right? He used everything at his disposal to do something about it. And I think we need to have that kind of determination. I'm so glad that we're in a church that has rocket ships on stage every once in a while. Because I think it just kind of shows we're a church that's all in. But that's not enough. It's not enough to be a church that's all in. It needs all of us being all in on helping the next generation, whether it's your kids or your grandkids or your nieces and nephews, or volunteering in our programs, or whatever it looks like for you. Being an active participant in it is the only way we all do this together. We said last week, this book that we've talked about for a few years, Canoeing the Mountains, is a great metaphor for what this is like. So this book chronicles Lewis and Clark's exploration of Louisiana Territory. Their whole job was to find a navigable water route from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. Meriwether Lewis was a river explorer, and so they literally thought they'd get to the Mississippi and they would float to the Pacific Ocean. The problem is the Rocky Mountains were in their way, and they literally couldn't canoe the mountains. They didn't know what to do. They had all the wrong gear. And apparently the Native Americans were trying to tell them that the mountains were there, and they thought like rolling hill. They did not think Rocky Mountains. So they had to decide, is the mission worth it? If it's worth it, we keep going. We figure out a way. And if that mission is worth it, how much more the mission of God? We got to figure out a way. It doesn't mean we have all the answers. Adaptive change is about saying, I don't know, but let's figure it out together. So how do we do that? How do we help? What's a starting point for helping the next generation? I actually want to reach back into some wisdom from a pastor from a few decades ago. Robert Schuller, regardless of what you think of him, he was really the pastor of the first megachurch at the Crystal Cathedral in California. Some of you are familiar with this church. And whatever you think of Robert Schuller, he did have a wonderful perspective and model that he used in his very beginning stages. How do we reach people? How do we help them with the gospel? He said this: find a need and meet it. Find a hurt and heal it. Find a problem and solve it. See, the way he saw it was, let's get practical with the gospel in people's lives. So how do we get practical with the gospel in the next generation's life? Well, first of all, you got to actually get to know the next generation, right? Like, we all think we know everybody in our community. But I'll bet if we went and talked to them, we would discover we really don't know them at all. We don't know them like we think we should. Same thing with our kids. Oh yeah, I've got kids in this age. Yeah, I know. Maybe. You know your kids. But even then, how well? How well do we know the next generation? I want to do something kind of fun today. Again, this is a little unusual day and an unusual style of sermon, but introverts in the room, I'm sorry ahead of time. I just want to take about a minute or two, if you just turn to someone next to you, and I want you to answer this question. In what ways, next slide, in what ways is life different for kids today than when you were growing up? And if you are a kid growing up today, that'll be really fun to explain to them. So go ahead, take like 2 minutes. Go ahead, amongst yourselves, go. Another 30 seconds, 30 seconds. I love it. This is such a great opportunity to say, in my day. All right, hey, I'd love to hear a couple. I apologize to everybody online because I'm going to be like moving around the room a little bit. You won't see me, but you get what's going on. But if you just raise hands, just want to hear a few of them. Yeah. Plastic straws. Amen. Technology, absolutely. Internet, social media. What's that? Coming home when the streetlights came on. Drinking out of the hose. What was that? Rent, $78. That's a good one. That's a good one. Someone from over here. Sunday dinner with family. What else? In the back there. What was that? A more scheduled life right now. Absolutely. Yeah. Don't have to go to Blockbuster Video, which I miss terribly. It's a whole experience, man. Listen, growing up was so different. It's like, it's the same issues of adolescence or figuring out life and all of that, but it's all packaged in a completely different world. Completely different world. And unless we seek to understand this world, it's really hard to explain the gospel in a way that they're going to receive. And this is our mission. Our mission is to share the hope of Jesus Christ to every generation. And so we have to get to know what this generation growing up is all about. There's some great resources I want to point you to. Two of my favorites is Generation IY by Tim Elmore. He keeps updating this book, but this first came out a few years ago. It's a real nice baseline for this next generation. And also Carapal's Growing Young, which is another research-based book that they did of churches, 250 churches. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that if you're looking for resources. I know we spent some time over the last couple years looking at kind of the negative, but again, here are some positive numbers that just came out this last week about this next generation. 52% of teens in the United States are very motivated to learn about Jesus. 52%. I find that an incredibly hopeful number. There's an openness. 76% of Christian teens say that Jesus still matters to them. So as they're growing up, Jesus still matters to their everyday life. 7 out of 10, or 70% of adults and teens say they have a positive view of Jesus. Now, when you ask them about their view of the church, not so much, which is a problem. It's the old, I love your Jesus, but not your Jesus followers. Now, what we understand is that Jesus followers, we never claim to be perfect. We show up because we know we need help. We're forgiven by God's grace. But we need to do better. And 70% of Christian millennials, I know we got some millennials in the room, and you wear that badge very proudly, say that their commitment to Jesus is still important in their everyday life. That commitment they made perhaps when they were younger is still important. So there's actually a lot of really encouraging numbers. So let's start. Who is the next generation? Who in the world are we talking about? Well, let's talk about generations real quick. The Pew Research Center updates their generations. Apparently they decide and they lop off years and things shift. I don't know why, but it does. I'm sure there's lots of good reasons. But if you look at kind of all the living generations now, starting with the builder generation up here, if you were born between 1928 and 1945, so on and so forth. Builders, boomers, Generation X, the best one, of course. Kidding. Just kidding, not really. Millennials. And then here, it's two generations we're talking about. We're talking about the youngest generations. Generation Z, which is my kids' age. The youngest are about 10. all the way up until in their early 20s. And then now they're calling Generation Alpha all the kids under 10. And there's a lot they still don't know about this generation. They're seeing obviously a lot of trends from the previous generation, but they're still learning about them. But this is who we're talking about. So let's nail that down. All the basically under 21-year-olds is whom we're talking about. We're talking about the next generation. What do we know about them? The first one is clearly no surprise. They are digital in their DNA. They call them the 5 screens generation. They could be on 5 different things at once and still get their homework done. I don't know how. I need to be in a cave with all stimuli shut out so that I can focus. Not these kids. It's amazing. They can have a lot of things going on and still focus on their work. The other thing is, like, they knew how to use the iPad before you did. They've never been in a world where they didn't have the digital media in it. And that's the thing that's really, they're just not afraid of it. I remember my mom used to be scared of turning off the computer wrong because she thought she was going to break it. Like, it's a little different, right? This generation does not have that fear. And what else? So this is such a big part of their lives. Certainly, it's how they learn. You ever been to a classroom recently of your kids or grandkids? It's a little different than when you were growing up. When I was growing up, in my day, we had the rows of desks all facing the teacher who was just lecturing. Nowadays, no. It's like tables facing each other and smart boards and Chromebooks, and it's just totally different. And if we don't adjust for that in the life of the church, they're not going to learn as well. They're not going to hear it as well. It's not going to make as much sense because it's just not how they learn anymore. It's also how they connect, you know this, not just social media, but it's how they connect with the life and the world around them. It's how they find a sense of identity, which is all over the place. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. It's how they are entertained. I don't know how many times my son can watch YouTube videos of a guy, falling off a bicycle, but whatever that number is, it's a lot. It's how they're entertained. There was a marketing book that came out early on Gen Z that I found really fascinating. From a marketing perspective, how do you reach the next generation? And I think this is interesting for us to think about. And that is, they discovered that their marketing on social media has to be 8 seconds or less. Isn't that wild? 8 seconds. And you have to be able to get your message across without any sound, because a lot of kids are watching without sound because they're in school or around parents or whatever, right? You got to be able to do that in 8 seconds. And it has to feel authentic, seamless and consistent, friendly, human, humorous, compassionate, and secure in 8 seconds or less. What's wild is the next generation, for all the good, bad, and the ugly of social media and digital media, they're really savvy when it comes to filtering it out, which is probably a good thing. They're really discerning. They can sort of sense a fake the second they see it. All right, the other thing about this next generation is they are incredibly future-focused. They are still the most optimistic generation than the others. They feel like everything's ahead of them. There's a lot of optimism in the future, which is very counterintuitive based on how the world is. But so much so that they care more about the future than they care about the right now, which is interesting. Right? Don't know what we make of that other than it's just kind of what we've seen in this younger generation. Also, they had to deal with adapting to the pandemic in their time in school. And a lot of them will joke around Marvel, if you watch any Marvel movies, the blip. Right? It's like they had this section of their lives that was just kind of everything put on pause. And their whole life changed, and then it went back to normal. Then it felt like it was just like they lost a bunch of time. I know my daughter, when she graduated this year, she felt like she only had 3.5 or 3 years of school, because of the way that felt. We also know that in the pandemic, there was a big deal with, again, everybody's wearing masks, and I'm not here to talk about the politics of the mask. I think we're past that. But it had some very real social fallout for kids. How are you building trust and communicating when you can't see somebody's face? Not only that, but their sense of self-image. The mask became something to hide behind. And they felt very exposed when it was time to take those masks off. And some of you can relate to that. You kind of felt the same way. And then also, we know that mental health certainly suffered because of what they endured in the pandemic. And then you got kids missing pivotal moments, their senior year of high school, and other rituals that mean so much, or going off to college, and freshman year wasn't exactly the same because it was all of these rules and regulations. What else do we know about this generation? We know that they are both traditional and nonconformist. Here's what I mean. They are much more like their grandparents in their view of what matters in life. They have traditional views of the importance of the family and importance of relationship and all that. However, their view of what a family looks like is completely different. It's very nonconformist. They're a generation they're an activism generation. They believe in upholding justice, whether it's climate justice, gender justice, racial justice, whatever they perceive to be an issue of justice, they will get out and they will protest. They will go and volunteer for a cause. And whatever you think about all that stuff sort of doesn't matter. It's how they are. And so I think this is important to know, because if you're not addressing this in some way, you're really missing an opportunity to bring the gospel to bear in those issues as well. Then the next one is, this might be the most important, they crave community. They crave community, physical community. So they certainly are getting digital community in a way that we probably can't really understand. And some of it's really cool. Kids, in some ways, are communicating with each other more than any other generation. And they're connecting with each other, like on Snapchat, to see where to go meet, to go do something physically. They're also able to keep in touch with people like we never could. My son goes off to camp. He's about to go to FCA camp this week. He's still in touch with kids from last year's FCA camp who all are Jesus-believing athletes that he can connect with throughout the year. And it's awesome. For all of its ills that we talk about with social media, it also has an upside of connection. But they crave physical connection in a deep, deep way. I was talking with one of these counselors this last week, and I was just asking, what kind of church are you interested in? And she said, great preaching's great, and good worship services and engaging worship services are great, but I'd rather be at a church that disciples me, even if the preaching and everything else is bad. I'd rather be at that church that disciples me. It's a craving for relationship outside of Sunday morning, which actually is awesome. And so, they crave community. And in this Gen Z book, I love how he puts this. It says, Gen Z is communicating faster than you can plan, learning faster than you can teach, and consuming faster than you can create. So take a deep breath and stop trying to get it perfect. Instead, just get real. What's that mean? What do young people crave? Authentic relationship. That book, Growing Young, that I alluded to. They researched 1,300 young churchgoers between 15 and 29 years old. The number one by far was they craved authentic connection. And this phrase came out of the book that says, warm is the new cool. What's that mean? What are they looking for in a church? A church that loves them. They'll take that over any other thing that you're going to do. And here's the good news. Every church in America can be that. We don't have to have fog machines. The pastor doesn't have to wear skinny jeans, thank God. They, they just want a place where they feel loved, where they feel welcomed, where they want people who are going to pour into them, to disciple them, to teach them, hey, what does it look like to walk with Jesus? And here's the part that's on us. We'd better be walking with Jesus, or else how are we going to share this with the next generation? We can't. Remember, they could spot a fake. We need to have a vibrant relationship with Jesus so that we can show them how to do it. I know we go through all these stats and numbers, and it basically comes down to we need to love kids and show them what it looks like to live in faith, which is the same, and it's been every generation since Jesus. And that, I think, is very encouraging. Jesus didn't mince words around this. In Mark chapter 10, a bunch of kids are coming to Jesus, and the disciples are trying to put it to a stop. Basically, like, Jesus is too important to deal with the kids. He's got more important things to do. Watch Jesus' reaction. People were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. Now, that's a side of Jesus I don't want to be on, for the record. I don't know what that looked like, but I don't want anything to do with that. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly, I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." Wonder how Jesus really feels. Well, in case you're wondering, watch this. This is great. I love this passage because I think some people think Jesus came to give us a hug. Right? Jesus, I just like nice Jesus. And God of the Old Testament's just too mean sometimes. And watch what Jesus says here. Well, after he took the children in his arms, placed his hands on them, and blessed them. Now watch what he does in this next verse. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. You welcome one of these children, you're welcoming me. Now watch what he says next. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Here's a hug. Like, he wasn't messing around. Because what good is our faith if it's not for our children and our children's children? If we're not doing everything in our power to help go against the tide of culture and bring people to Jesus. You know what it is? It's actually, we need to get out of Jesus' way and then lead them on the path that leads to Jesus. A couple of things as we figure out how we move forward as a church, and I think all of us as individuals. The first is, I think we need to be learners so we can speak their language. You don't have to love everything your kids and grandkids love. I don't. But you have to know what they are so that you could speak their language. Remember that story last week about my friend Matt singing, "Lord, I lift your name on high" in a German bar? It just didn't make any sense. They did not hear it. Unless we know their language, it's not going to make any sense. The second, they live in the information age. They don't need necessarily information. We need to give interpretation. We need to help them with application. What do you do with the information about Jesus or about a life of faith? Number 3, we need to give them handwritten attention in a smartphone world. We need to build relationships. There is nothing quite like getting a handwritten note of encouragement, although many of our kids couldn't read them now if they're in cursive. Isn't that funny? Very different. Personal attention. And we need to lead them to Jesus so he can bless them. Jesus is the one doing the blessing. We got to point the way, and we got to do a good job of it. And that's why we do all this. We just want to point kids to Jesus. We hope that through Vacation Bible School or anything that we're doing, It's planting a seed. It's opening a door. It's helping them understand that there is a God. He is real. He loves them no matter what. That's why we put all this time and energy and money into pulling stuff like this off. And here's the cool part. Just like in places where reefs have died across the ocean, they've seen places where they've been completely regenerated. And I think if that's true for reefs, it's true for the church even more so. The church can adapt and flourish if we help the next generation win. Amen.